Thank you very much, Muriel. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Theosophical Society and especially Leslie Price and Janet Lee for the organization of this conference and for their interest in our research. Additionally, I would like to say how grateful I am towards Muriel Pécastin-Boissière for her kind and lasting support and for associating me with her activities. And I'm also thrilled to share the platform with dear colleagues and friends. So, I will start by explaining how I got interested in the link, because I think that it has an influence on the way I approach this primary source. As Muriel has just said, 2 years ago, I completed a PhD on Annie Besant's Socialism. And at first, I was not really interested in the link because it seemed to me to be a religious project rather than a socialist paper. And indeed, many secondary sources repeated that with the link, Annie Besant had sought to build, quote, the church of the future, an expression that she used herself when she presented her project. And I have to admit that the link was also far less easily accessible than other writings by Annie Besant. First of all, because its circulation had been smaller than Our Corner or the National Reformer, and it had neither been reprinted nor digitalized as many of her pamphlets. However, when I finally got hold of the paper and was able to study it, I realized how important it was to understand her last years of socialism and to interpret two of her major battles, the Match Women's strike and her election at the London School Board. The link is crucial to avoid retrospective look, but to try and understand Besant's point of view before and during these events. Delving into the pages of the link also offers an interesting insight in Annie Besant's political and social ideas in 1888, which means 1 year before her adoption of theosophy. We can see how she tried to arouse enthusiasm for social and political reform and how she tried to alleviate the plight of the poorest. I will start by explaining how the project of the link emerged in 1887-88. I will then challenge the traditional image of the paper to try and show that the link was first and foremost a political and social project. And finally, I will try to show that the Match Women's strike and the election to the London School Board are outcomes of the ideas and strategies set up at the beginning of the project. When the link was launched in February 1888, Annie Besant was already a famous, or rather infamous, public figure, and she had been an active socialist for more than 2 years. Jean-Michel and Deborah before me have talked about her agnosticism and neo-Malthusianism, so I won't come back on these aspects of her career. I would just like to say that in the link she continued to defend the social and political reforms that she had already defended before, and she put a renewed emphasis in that paper on altruism. Now, I will move on directly to her socialist ideas and activities to try and explain her position within the socialist movement. Annie Besant declared herself a socialist in 1885 after much hesitation. But on the debate over free meals in board schools, she finally took her distance with her radical and neo-Malthusian colleagues of the National Secular Society, and she started to openly endorse socialist ideas. Though Annie Besant remained an influential member of the National Secular Society, she was elected to the Fabian Society in June 1885, and she was soon also elected to its executive committee. Within the Fabian Society, Besant tried to push forward her ideas. She defined a gradualist transition towards socialism, which means that she was opposed to the idea of revolution, and she defended a form of collectivism, which means that she was in favor of state intervention in the economy and even state management of the economy. Relying on her experience in the National Secular Society, she also sought to organize a militant network, and she insisted on the importance of standing for elections. As she also had a practical mind, she explained that to win elections, or at least to spread their ideas, the socialists had to create alliance with the radicals who were increasingly dissatisfied with the Liberal Party. Though Besant represented a valuable recruit for the Fabian Society, its members were rather reluctant and refused to endorse all her ideas. So Besant did not restrict her activities to this small discussion group, and she also joined the members of the Social Democratic Federation and the Socialist League, who defended the unemployed and helped organize their demonstration. And in the 1880s, indeed, there was an economic crisis which led to social unrest with many demonstrations and also many strikes. From 1885, Annie Besant was involved in the defense of the socialist militants who were arrested during public demonstrations and who were not granted a fair trial. And she also wanted to defend free speech, but this time in open-air places. It was therefore no wonder that Annie Besant took an active part in the massive rally on Trafalgar Square that took place on Sunday the 13th of November 1887. The demonstrators were brutally assaulted by the police, who had forbidden the rally, and many were arrested. This demonstration was therefore dubbed Bloody Sunday. In the immediate aftermath, Annie Besant was involved in the defense of those who had been arrested and in claiming the right of the people to gather in Trafalgar Square in order to maintain the freedom of speech. And it is in this context that she met the journalist W.T. Stead, who had taken the initiative of creating the Law and Liberty League with the support of more than 40 liberal, radical and socialist organizations, and also with the support of many liberal personalities. As the Law and Liberty League, or the LLL, had the same objectives as Besant, fair trial and free speech, Annie Besant was soon elected to its executive committee. The Law and Liberty League is important because the paper, The Link, which was launched barely 3 months later, was presented as the official organ of the LLL. Oh, no. In January 1888, the LLL had been active for a few months, and it was now dominated by radicals and socialists. It now tried to become more than a federation of existing organizations, so the General Assembly adopted new rules and principles and created local branches called vigilance circles. These vigilance circles had 3 main missions. First, they had to report cases of police violence. Secondly, the members of the circles also had to report on any type of injustice. Indeed, the members of the LLL had, quote, to note, investigate and report any case of injustice to or oppression of the poor, so that legal aid may be rendered if possible, and in all cases public opinion may be appealed to. Even though this sentence is quite vague, it is clear that the leaders of the LLL wanted to denounce cases of outrageous sweating. The third type of mission was more political. The circles of the LLL had to monitor political life in their districts, and because they had to, quote, take part in local elections, aiding any candidate who is in favor of free speech and who has done service to the poor. And that's in order to create an efficient network of militants and to promote these 3 objectives that Annie Besant insisted on the creation of a weekly halfpenny paper. It was entitled The Link because it was meant to create a link between the different, the various circles of the LLL, the various vigilance circles. Before coming back to The Link, I think it is now important to present Stead, who co-edited the paper with Annie Besant. Stead was a famous journalist. He was a liberal and nonconformist, and according to him, the journalist had to promote democracy, social reform, and universal peace. As a fervent Christian, he saw his job as a crusade to improve society. And he had become particularly famous in 1885 with a series entitled The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, that he had published in his Pall Mall Gazette. With a sensationalist investigation, he had sought to denounce juvenile prostitution, and he had managed to pressure Parliament into voting a law that raised the age of consent to 16. Stead is considered a pioneer of what was called new journalism. First, he took up many formal innovations from the American press to make his papers easier to read and more entertaining. And he also adopted a more informal and sensationalist tone. And secondly, he changed the focus of his activities as a journalist because he abandoned long and sometimes boring parliamentary reports and speeches for, on the contrary, stories which affected the people directly. His objective was to denounce crime, poverty, and any form of injustice, because he considered that his job was a divine mission to improve society. So, in spite of their religious differences, Besant and Stead decided to collaborate because they had the same goal of fighting against injustice and improving the world in which they lived. The collaboration with the link is interesting, but the paper has had a very bad reputation. So, I will not make a long list of all the negative comments I've come across on the link during my research, but I will move on directly to what I think is the source of that negative image. In his 1961 biography of Annie Besant, Arthur Nethercott presented the link thanks to the title of some of its section. Rather than focusing on the articles and the editorials, he presented the title of some of the sections of the paper. For example, he explained that the People's Pillory was an archaic form of exposure to public disgrace. As for the section entitled "To be done by order of the Executive, Law and Liberty League," it would have illustrated the top-down organization of the LLL. Nethercott concluded his description by saying that, quote, "These sections look innocent at first, but sharp-sighted critics like Bradlaugh and Heinemann saw their potential dangers of totalitarianism and dictatorship, of subornation and misuse of anonymous and unproven accusations." So that was quite an indictment. When we look more closely at these sections, we can say that nothing, but absolutely nothing, justifies Nethercott's interpretation. In the People's Pillory, Besant and Stead never encouraged anonymous denunciation. And we can even say that they subverted the traditional image of the pillory, because what they wanted to expose were the scandals and the misdeeds of the ruling class, rather than the petty crimes of the people. So that inversion, that subversion is quite interesting. Additionally, neither the tone of the paper nor the structure of the LLL suggested a military organization. No order was given in the section entitled "To be done by order of the Executive." I've read all the sections in detail, and I can tell you that this section was only made of reports and announcements linked to the LLL. The second reason why the link has been misinterpreted is due to Annie Besant herself. In her autobiography, she presented it as a first step towards theosophy, and she insisted on the idea that with the link she had the intention of building, quote, "this new church dedicated to the service of man." As a consequence, historians such as Catherine Wessinger have claimed that with the link, quote, "she made her first experiment in the founding of a new religion with a millennial goal." On the contrary, my contention is that the link is first and foremost a political and social paper. As a consequence, the military and religious references are to be analysed as metaphors. Annie Besant openly compared her project to a military endeavour, and she even compared the situation to that of Cromwell before the battle against the monarchy. Having very probably read Carlyle's edition of Cromwell's letters, she explained that she wanted to recreate the fervour of his early battles. The name she wanted to give to the groups responsible for coordinating the actions of the vigilant circles was the Ironside circles. And Ironside was the nickname of the best soldiers of the army of Cromwell, an army that was famous for its almost democratic organization. Annie Besant even claimed that the members of the LLL would form the army of the common weal. So it was both a political and moral army, the army of the Republic, but also the army of the common good, this moral army. Though these metaphors seem very odd today in the 20th century, they were not in the 19th century, and it is really important, I think, to bear in mind. Annie Besant used this metaphor, these references, to trigger enthusiasm and to add solemnity to her project. But the link and the LLL were definitely not a military project, since the only weapons she wanted to use were words, public exposure, and boycotts. Now, as for the references to religion, which were present mostly in the first editorials of the paper, they also have to be analyzed as metaphors. Even though Besant instead explained that they wanted to found a new church dedicated to the service of man, it was only a symbolical rather than a real church. They neither sought to implement rites nor encourage spiritual quest. They wanted, that's what they said, they wanted to use religious methods because, according to them, these methods had proved their efficiency. But what Besant instead wanted to was, quote, work for the temporal redemption of mankind in the secular sphere of politics and industry. In the secular sphere of politics and industry, that's what they were interested in. So the link was not a religious project, but its language sometimes echoed Auguste Comte and his religion of humanity that had so fascinated Besant when she had become a freethinker. However, the epigraph of each issue of the link was a quote by Victor Hugo. So, the quote, "The people are silence. I will be the advocate of this silence. I will speak for the dumb. I will speak of the small to the great, and of the feeble to the strong. I will speak of all the despairing silent one, for all the despairing silent ones. I will be the word of the people. I will be the bleeding mouth where the gag is snatched out. I will say everything." Besant instead carefully took out all the religious references of the initial quote in order to give a more secular tone to their project. And this quote is particularly important and interesting because it summed up the way W.T. Stead saw his vision as his mission as a journalist. That's why I think that link is to be understood within the context of new journalism. With its numerous sections, its focus on people's lives, and the fact that it sought to create public indignation and to denounce injustice, I think that's why the link is to be understood within that context. And it was also seen as a weapon in a three-folded crusade. So let's move on to these three objectives. As the official organ of the LLL, the link first defended free speech and the right of public meeting in Trafalgar Square, as in the editorial entitled Our Square. The link also offered news of this battle and also of the struggle to obtain fair trials for the demonstrators who had been arrested and brutalized by the police. But Besant instead also focused on more political objectives. With the link, they defended the idea of an independent political representation of the working classes. They explained that the working classes could no longer rely on the liberals to represent their interests. So they recommended to fight against the caucuses, which led to the appointment by the ruling elite of liberal candidates who sometimes ill-suited working-class constituencies. But before waiting for the politicians to improve the condition of the poorest, the link tried to show that it was necessary and it was even possible to act. So first of all, the middle class had to understand that their wealth was associated with duty, and that so the middle class had to undertake philanthropic and paternalistic activities. Secondly, the workers themselves could be active. They had to report to the LLL employers who did not respect the existing protective legislation, especially the Employers' Liability Act and the Truck Amendment Act passed in the 1880s. The first one, the Employers' Liability Act, enabled the worker to seek compensation for injuries at work, while the second one, the Truck Amendment Act, outlawed deduction and fines. It's interesting just to note quickly that at that point they did not mention the action of the trade unions. Finally, the third type of action was to be led by the journalists, because they had, according to Besant and Stead, the journalists had a crucial role to play to fight against economic and social injustice. The journalists had to use their influence, their talent and their knowledge of the law to expose outrageous injustice and to create public indignation. I will now try to show you that it is while pursuing two of these objectives that Annie Besant got involved in the Match Women's strike and in the election to the London School Board. In this section on the strike of the Match Women at Bryant and Mays in the East End of London, I won't present the strike in details because it could be the subject of a whole conference. Let me rather refer you to Louise Rowe's book, Striking a Light. What I want to do here is focus on the link, first to reassess Besant's strategy at the eve of the strike and during the strike, but also to offer some new perspectives on this major industrial struggle. At the end of the 1880s, many social reformers were concerned about the situation of female match women in the East End. Annie Besant heard more precisely about their low wages during a debate at the Fabian Society in June 1888. As a journalist who wanted to raise public awareness on an outrageous situation, Annie Besant decided to inquire. So she went to the factory at the end of the working day and interviewed some of the workers. The result of her inquiry was published in the link under the title White Slavery in London, a metaphor which, among other things, recalled the series of articles by Stead on juvenile prostitution 3 years before. Many consider that this article, White Slavery in London, triggered the strike, but this was not at all Annie Besant's intention. She only acted in accordance with the objectives of the link. She wanted to provoke the employers with annoying revelations, and she recommended a boycott. In her article, she insisted on the very low wages as opposed to the high dividends. She also described the difficult and even dangerous working conditions of the match workers. But more importantly, she revealed that the workers were regularly fined, which was illegal, and it is on this point, on the fines, that she hoped to outrage her readers and public opinion at large. In order to exert pressure on the company, she sent them her article. She informed the labour inspector and she distributed 500 copies of the link in front of the factory. Besant had warned about what she considered as the dangers of a strike, but the situation in the factory was particularly tense between the workers and the employers and the managers. The ringleaders who had talked to Besant were finally sacked, and on July the 7th, their colleague decided to stop work in protest. And very soon, about 1,400 workers were on strike. When she heard about the outbreak of a strike, Besant started collecting funds. She also helped the striker to manage their strike fund and to make their voice heard. But she also continued to follow her initial strategy because she believed that the battle would be won in the media. And my contention is that she was not completely wrong on that point. So she used the pages of the link and also the pages of other radical papers to reveal other annoying facts about Bryant and May. And after a week, when the mainstream press started to endorse Besant's statements about fines and about the ill treatment of the workers, the employers were forced to negotiate. In the end, after less than 2 weeks, the match women went back to work. All of them were reinstated and the system of fines was abolished. So everybody considered that they had won their strike. Reading carefully the reports on the match women in the pages of the link allows us to see the coherence of Besant's strategy and also her adaptation to the evolution of a changing situation. But contrary to what some historians have suggested, she never presented herself as a strike leader, nor tried to overshadow the workers that she would have scorned, despised. The link also gives some details that historians have neglected. For example, thanks to the list of contributors to the strike fund, we can study the origin of the financial support that the match women received. And about 1/3 of this fund was collected by the London Trades Council, which shows that the traditional trade unions were ready to help the match women. This is quite surprising because historians have usually insisted on the opposition between these two worlds, the world of skilled, unionized male workers who were employed on a regular basis, as opposed to the world of unskilled female, immigrant, ununionized and seasonal workers. And on the contrary, the reports about the strike and its aftermath in the link show that the boundaries between these two worlds were far less rigid than we might have thought. Now, the election to the London School Board. Annie Besant didn't seek to defend the working classes only thanks to journalism. She was also convinced of the effectiveness of political action. That's why, as early as May 1888, the Link published an article on the elections to the London School Board to be held in the following December. The school board had been created in 1871 with the Education Act. Women could vote in these elections and could also stand for election. In London, the school board managed around 400 schools. The article in the Link in May was meant to arouse the interest of its readers, and it urged them to register, but also to take part in the designation of candidates in order to avoid the monopoly of the traditional parties and community leaders. So, a quote from that article. "The democratic organizations of the London people must recognize their duty in the school board elections. Every working men's club, every political association, every branch of the National League or of any socialist society ought at once to appoint a small subcommittee to consider the approaching school board election. And these committees should undertake the selection of suitable candidates." In the following weeks, the Link reported on the progression of that idea among socialists and radicals. And in September, Annie Besant took part in the creation of a Central Democratic Committee, which coordinated the action in each electoral division and which drafted a common program. This program demanded free, secular and compulsory education. It also recommended a more democratic organization of the schools, the opening of the schools for entertaining, recreational and cultural activities, and the program also demanded 1 free meal a day for needy children. For historian David Rubinstein, the creation of that Central Democratic Committee with radical and socialist organizations, quote, "throws interesting light on the strength of socialism in London at the time, the weakness or tolerance of many radicals and their willingness to separate themselves from orthodox liberalism." The preparation of this election also illustrates the dialogue between the socialists and the radicals, the socialists, the radicals and the reformist organization that the Link had sought to promote from the start. Here are the divisions of the London School Board election. In each division, each joint committee started to select their candidates. And at the end of October, in the section entitled Notes on the London School Board election, the Link announced that Besant had been elected by the Joint Committee of the Tower Hamlets division to be one of their candidates. So we can say that her candidacy was not an individual, isolated or spontaneous action. It was the result of a carefully thought out strategy of alliance with the radicals that Annie Besant had tried to defend to defend since her adoption of socialism, and that she had also promoted with the link. The joint committees elected 7 socialist candidates, but among them only Annie Besant and Stuart Headlam in Hackney were finally elected, because thanks to their support in radical circles. Unfortunately, the link ceased publication in December 1888, so it could not report the actions of Annie Besant on the London School Board. I will therefore only say that she defended the common programme and that she successfully struggled for contractors of the LSB to pay their employees at least trade union rates, and that made her particularly famous in labour circles. So, to conclude, the link has often been considered as a move away from socialism and a first step towards theosophy for Annie Besant. It is indeed true that it was around 1888 that Annie Besant started to feel the limits of her socialist ideas and that she started questioning her materialism. However, as we have seen, nothing in the link directly announced her adoption of theosophy 1 year later. With the link, Besant took up many of the ideas from new journalism, and she clearly saw her paper as a means to foster social and political reforms. Though the concepts of brotherhood, service of man, selflessness are ubiquitous in the link, it is only with theosophy that these concepts acquired for Annie Besant a less political and social dimension. So there was continuity in the ideals that Annie Besant defended, but as a woman of action rather than a doctrinaire, she was ready to adapt her ideals and make them evolve when she identified their limits. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marie, for presenting us Annie Besant as also a strategist, a practical mind, and I think it tends to be forgotten sometimes, and also for at least, defining the link for what it really was, and its religious metaphors as efficient means of passing on what was actually a political and a social message. So thank you, really. Do we have questions here? Yes, Kurt.
So I want to thank you for clarifying something about that passage in the autobiography where she makes the link, so to speak, from the link to theosophy. Recently rereading it, I found myself suspicious about the claim that there actually was a link. And you filled out and contextualized that question for me. But my real reason in speaking up is I recently came across a lecture of Annie Besant given in 1929 when she was 82, when she spoke about the match girls strike in a way that I think bears some investigation. And in this lecture, she says that the Theosophical Order of Service, which she founded in 1908, has as its motto the same motto that she had chosen as a slogan for the match girls strike, which goes something like this: a union of all who love in the service of all who live. And she describes how the match girls sent a deputation to her journalism office, a large group that couldn't fit inside the very small office, and that she asked them to choose a spokesperson. And this was the way that she was persuaded to step into the strike itself. And I'm curious if you've run across anything in your research that seems to corroborate this story. And if not, of course, I'm happy to offer it to you. I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, no, I haven't come across that episode, but it's it fits with what I knew about the way the match women came to see her and the way she got involved.
I'm especially interested in how whether that slogan really was in use, or whether she backdated
Yeah,
it.
I've never seen it, but I think it was quite easy, as I've tried to show with even the sentence that you have here: a journal for the servants of man. that could be interpreted in different ways. And
Yes. Thank you.
And just to come back on what you said, I very often say that Annie Besant was a woman of action, and that's what I've said, not rather than a doctrinaire. That's why there was also the strategy also has to be taken into account, and she could analyze the way a situation was evolving, and she also took into consideration the audience she was speaking to, and sometimes in two different conferences, you see things that will change a little bit, and then when you consider the audience she was addressing, you can understand the slight changes that he might have brought.
2 minutes. Okay. Another question? Yes, please.
Yeah, you said that she was originally attracted to Comte's Church of Humanity. Do you have a few extra details about that?
Yes, she wrote Auguste Comte. He's something. There are three elements in the title. But in 1875, she wrote a pamphlet about 30 pages on Auguste Comte, his philosophy, his something. I can give you the details about it. And she was quite critical because I think she read Auguste Comte through. She could read it in French, but she also read the criticism leveled at Auguste Comte by John Stuart Mill. Mm-hmm. And she has the same type of criticism that John Stuart Mill leveled at Auguste Comte. But she remained very attracted to his idea of selflessness and religion of humanity. But she was not at all interested in the actual building of a church. Yes. And she was never close to that movement in England, because there was a movement, I can't remember their name exactly, but who wanted to create a church, a religion of humanity with a church and so on, and she was never close to them. The positivists, yes.
Okay, well, I think we'll call it not a day, but half a day. Thank you all. We'll have a lunch break now and come back together at 2. Thank you. Thank you.